Coming up in this video, 17 books, 13 new releases, including reviews of the Bernie Sanders memoir, debut novels from actors Ryan O'Connell and Tom Hanks, new novels from literary heavyweights Brandon Taylor and Ayobami Adebayo, classics from Jose Saramago and Petry and Thomas Hardy, and In Memoriam, Nothing Special, The Last Animal, The Nursery, Chain Gang AllStars, and more. Hello, welcome back to Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. My name is Scott and I talk about books on this channel. I've had a small break from filming. I'm back. I'm feeling positive. I've just finished all of my uni work for the semester and I've watched more booktube in the past 48 hours than I have in the past 14 days. I've read a bunch of books and I feel like a better human being. Life is much better without stress. But before I get into the books that I've got to review today, I have two quick things to say. Firstly, I made a video about gender diversity and the Woman's Prize and I got some super thanks in the comments of that video, which I never expected. I was just blown away by. And I also got a few people using my Ko-fi account, which is linked in the show notes. And just massive thank you to people who have said thank you financially to what I am doing on this channel. That is so amazing and thank you. You lot are wonderful. Speaking of money, I want to do a quick public service announcement. My lovely friend and fellow booktuber Kevy is going through a tough time and needs some help. You might have seen her video. She's in a terrible housing situation and has set up a GoFundMe to help her get out of that. She's really close to meeting her target. I know not everybody is in a position to give financially, but I urge you, if you are, consider donating. She's so close to that target. Every tiny bit helps her. And it's the sort of thing that will really allow her to move forward and thrive. Let's get into the books. And as always, I will start with the DNFs. And I just want to say that I DNF hard. I DNF anything that I think is going to be average, anything I'm not in the mood for. And a lot of the times, I just get that wrong. It's a stats game for me. I just need to get more right than I get wrong. I always tell you why I DNF a book and it's up to you to decide if that's an important issue for you. Just by looking at him. Ryan O'Connell. Ryan O'Connell is a gay actor with cerebral palsy and I quite liked him in Queer as Folk. I don't have a lot of problems reading very graphic gay sex scenes, but this was really next level. And when I read a graphic sex scene, I don't need live action descriptions. I don't need to know the exact mechanics of what's happening. What I want to know, the thing that's important to me is, are the characters having a good time? What are they feeling? What are their emotions? And I was just getting a lot of description of very kinky acts and not a lot of feelings. It was just a bit too close to porn for me. Skye Falling, Mia McKenzie. It's all about the gay novels. I am so sorry, not on Pride Month. I promise there is a fantastic LGBT novel later in this video. The premise of this book is that bisexual Skye, a 40-year-old woman who doesn't have her life together, is contacted by a 12-year-old who claims Skye donated eggs and is her biological mother. And she seems pretty cool and has some questions of Skye, who just generally freaks out and climbs out a window and runs away, but later decides she was a bit of a dick and wants to make things right. In the meantime, she tries and fails to hit on a woman in a record store who turns out to be that girl's actual mother. I just wasn't getting any explanation for Skye in this book. I knew she was freaking out because she climbed out of the window. I knew she was attracted to women because she hit on the woman in the record shop. I knew she had a troubled family life because she avoided talking to her relatives, but I didn't know why she was doing any of them. I didn't know whether she felt anxious or scared or guilty. If you climb out of a window to avoid a conversation with a 12-year-old and you don't speak to your mother and you don't tell me why that is in a book, then that's not good enough. We only want what's best. Carolyn Swindell. This was a really early DNF. This book just changed point of views way too quickly for me. I don't feel like I got to learn a character before we jumped onto the next one. It was as if Carolyn Swindell had drunk too many coffees when she wrote this. Nothing special by Nicole Flattery, another early DNF. This one just didn't grab me. It didn't give me good feelings. I thought it was really likely that this was going to end up being a 2 or a 3-star book, so it left. The making of another major motion picture masterpiece. Tom Hanks. Last DNF for this video. This is in many ways exactly what you might have expected from Tom Hanks. I suspect that Hanks really enjoys reading movie scripts before he decides what parts he wants to act in, and his prose feels like a movie narration. It feels very made for screen. And that might be intentional because Hanks is clearly writing a novel that is very close to home, where that is an appropriate feel for a book, but also I couldn't tell. At the very start of this novel, Hanks says that there is no such thing as a bad movie, that hate is something that should be reserved for fascism. Amen, Conrad Tom. He went on to say that there are just good movies that don't work for you. I thought that I really liked that, but Tom, you've clearly never seen a single Transformer movie, have you? Hanks can write a sentence, but he's just telling me stuff. He's not showing me stuff. This kind of feels like ChatGPT wrote a novel. It feels like a novel, but it doesn't have the soul of a book. It doesn't make me happy. On to the books I've finished. And that's it. The bad books are over. Everything from here on in is a recommendation. Although I will say that the last 5 books are a step up. But it has been a really, really good reading period for me. The Last Animal. This book is a long way from the finest book in the wrap-up, but it is an enjoyable ride. There are just a few little things you're going to have to ignore when you read this book. Jane is a scientist working in ancient DNA, specifically with woolly mammoths and the ancient Iceman her now dead husband helped discover. She has 2 teenage daughters, Eve and Vera, who travel the world with her because that's something that scientists do apparently, and who, upon visiting Siberia, just so happen to find a very well-preserved woolly mammoth defrosting in the tundra. The team that Jane works with helps extract DNA from the mammoth, and then Jane meets this rich old lady who seems to be a cross between Jane Goodall and Cruella de Vil. She just so happens to have an elephant in her possession and somehow convinces Jane to impregnate her with the woolly mammoth DNA. This is really a novel about motherhood, about home, and what those two things mean. We see that explored through Jane's relationship with Eve and Vera, with her relationship with a baby woolly mammoth, through the motherless rich old elephant owner, through the surprising and completely weird days of our life ancient DNA scientist kind of event that happens that I won't spoil for you. Reality really isn't intended to be part of this novel. The Nursery, Szilvia Molnar. This is a book about a mother who has just given birth. It is a novel about postpartum depression. Our unnamed narrator feels all over the place, and it gives us a real yellow wallpaper feel to it. In that novel, The Yellow Wallpaper, we don't know if the protagonist is being gaslit or if she's suffering from a mental break. In this book, it's quite similar, and I think that there's something that we all just need to acknowledge about babies. Under the Geneva Convention, sleep deprivation is considered torture and it isn't allowed. That means that babies are war criminals. Cute, stinky war criminals. Through this book, we are hearing the internal monologue of somebody who is suffering, who has disordered thinking, who is starting to think and say horrible things about her baby. We also see the husband who thinks he's doing a wonderful job as a husband, but who clearly isn't. And I thought that communication block, that communication gap was really well depicted, and how under sleep deprivation it gets even harder to resolve those sorts of barriers. Where this book loses points for me though is the quirky tone. I don't feel like it was quite right for this novel. It certainly wasn't funny enough to pull it off. But otherwise, I think this is a fabulous book. River Spirit, Leila Aboulela, a historical fiction set in 19th century Sudan. And I don't think I've ever read a book from a Sudanese author before. I could be wrong on that. I just don't keep a list. But I've certainly never read about the Mahdist Wars. I didn't even know what that was. Learning something about a country, about a people, or a historical event is always something I enjoy in a book. So if that's you too, this book is worth reading for that aspect alone. One thing I think is fascinating is the depiction of slavery within Sudan. When we read stories about slavery, we so often read books that are set in America, but this is so different. It is a different culture with different values and different customs, and it produces a different type of slavery. But they also have some similarities, and it's still abhorrent. But at the same time, it really does point out just how horrible slaves were treated in the US. Because in comparison, this slavery seems kinder when in actual fact it's pretty terrible. Our protagonists, Akune and her brother Bol, become orphans. They are taken by a merchant who promises to look after them. And as this happens, the self-acclaimed Mahdi, a prophesized redeemer in the Quran, appears and starts to amass an army and fight against the Ottoman rule. And our merchant Yassine feels the need to join the fight against him and leaves Akane and her brothers in the hands of people who eventually sell her. Then there is this Scottish gentleman who wants to paint Akane and who ends up buying her. And I think I really should point out that all of this selling of people is happening in a society where there are anti-slavery laws. The way this Scottish painter justifies his actions is both really interesting and really horrifying. It was a real highlight of the novel to see his internal dialogue and how it got twisted by himself to justify his actions. This book is really gloriously complex because you have the Sudanese faction in this war, you have the Ottomans, you have the Egyptians, and then you have the British. And they're all there with different ideas and different values and different interests. Then there's the religious ideals, people changing sides, zealots, turncoats, and to be honest, there was just a little bit too much going on for me to follow everything. I could have done with just one or two things less. I do think that if you're Sudanese or you're up to date with your Sudanese history, you probably won't have an issue with this one and you'll enjoy it. Overall, this is just such a worthwhile read. It's okay to be angry about capitalism. Bernie Sanders. That's good, Bernie, because I'm angry. This was Bernie Sanders talking about how society is broken, how politics is broken, and trying to give you a rah-rah, there's still hope pep talk. He discusses why so many politicians don't like him, how close he got to winning either of the elections he participated in, and why we shouldn't give up hope. I'm aware that politically, Sanders is a divisive character, but it is interesting to learn how politics works, how to win elections. Yeah, this book is full of socialist ideas, but I think if you disagree with Sanders, you should listen to what he has to say for himself and not what other people are saying about him on his behalf. Maybe you'll still disagree with his ideas, but at least they won't be misrepresented to you. At least you can disagree with what he's actually saying and not what people are saying he's saying. This book is essentially a memoir of a period in Sanders' life, essentially from when he started running against Hillary to now. He is both critical and complimentary of many people in US politics. And I really liked his plain speaking, calling a spade style. He's criticizing people for things that they've done or said, things that you can easily quote or look up, not making up stories or alternative facts. Not the best piece of writing, but memoirs seldom are. And I was interested and engaged from beginning to end. A Spell of Good Things, Ayobami Adebayo. I DNF'd this a few months ago, and I said it wasn't the right time for me when I read it then. And I think that was a fantastic call, because I'm really glad I got to finish this book. And it's a lesson that I don't need to read every new release book as soon as I get my hands on a copy. This kind of felt like two interconnected novellas. Eniola is the oldest child of a very depressed, retrenched history teacher. Eniola's mother trains him and his sister in begging and goes about to her brothers and begs them for money to pay the rent and for their school fees. Eniola's uncle says to his mother, "Which child is the brightest? You can only afford to educate one." Eniola, as well as studying, is also working as a tailor's apprentice, which is something you pay to do if you live in Nigeria. Not only are they behind on school fees, but they're behind on apprenticeship payments. It's a bit of a desperate situation for young Eniola. Wariola is a young, beautiful woman, daughter of a wealthy businessman and about to marry the son of her father's friend, the son of a local, soon-to-be politician. Wariola's father has a difficult choice to make. He gives money to the local politician, and when he needs something, it's done for him. He can't go against him, but also he has to support his daughter's soon-to-be father-in-law. What emerges from these two situations is a stark look at Nigerian society. The corruption, the violence, the hard choices, how women are left behind and abused, how the poor are left behind and abused, how everybody is trying to cheat everybody else, how it's a real rat race. This is a really socially critical and highly political novel. I think this is really good, but I think it could have been two good novels, to be honest. Two fantastic ideas that don't really add a lot to each other. I mean, they are actually essential for the other story. Wariola and Eniola couldn't exist without the other person in their story. But the backstories, they don't add a lot to the other story. And it really slows down the pacing of the novel. It means we spend a lot of time setting up for what is a really high-octane and fantastic ending. The Street and Petri. This is the story of a newly single black woman, Lutie Johnson, and her son as they move into one of the only apartments they can afford on a street that they don't really like, with Jones, a creepy supervisor who lusts after Lutie, and Mrs. Hedges, easily my favourite character in this novel, a tough old madam who runs a brothel in the building and at times helps Lutie and at other times offers her work. This is a book about the traps and societal holes black people can easily fall into. Actually, I'm not sure I need to specify black. I think that this book is actually way more feminist than it is anti-racist. And it's really discussing the trappings of poverty. But then again, those things are all linked, aren't they? And it does highlight some aspects of black culture, music and the singing, for example. This is grim and miserable. I think everybody upon finishing this novel will put it down and just gently cuddle themselves. This book is somewhere between Zora Neale Hurston and Thomas Hardy. This is a book that everybody should read. I Could Live Here Forever. This is the story about when Leah met and fell in love with Charlie, a recovering heroin addict. It's a novel that is really just a portrait of a relationship, but you soon realise it's not a good one. The relationship, that is, the novel's actually quite good. Charlie acts erratically, sleeping until it's dark outside again, missing doctor's appointments, falling asleep mid-conversation or while driving a car, boldly declaring his love for Leah, texting her too much, texting her that he's at her front door asking if he can come in, not getting along with her friends. Charlie's behaviour in the relationship varies from amazingly caring to toxic and manipulative. Is Charlie abusive, or is he using again, or is it both? Yet it is very clear that Leah loves Charlie, and loves Charlie in a way that she's never loved anyone before. She really gets on with his mother, and is attracted by his unwashed smell, which is one of the more sickening signs that somebody is in love with you. Leila is also an aspiring young author, and while it is probably the most overused profession in books, for somewhat obvious reasons, this provided me with some real interesting insight into the writing process. I loved hearing about how characters develop in the mind of the author. They might start out as being somebody that they know, but how they grow in their head and they move in different directions and they soon become an entirely different person. This book is an absolute emotional roller coaster that had me hooked early, and it never went where I expected it to go. Chain Gang AllStars, Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. I would probably discuss this book much later in the video, but I wanted to slot it in a little early as I've already done a full discussion video on it. I love this book. It is a book where prisoners can exchange their sentence to appear on the hit television show Chain Gang AllStars, Bloodsport, for your entertainment. We follow queer lovers Loretta Thorwell and Hamara Hurricane Stacks, two champions closing in on winning the number of fights required for their freedom. Mixed in with this, there are stories of two black men who are also fighting for their freedom, one who has lost his arm in an industrial accident and the other who is suffering from some kind of mental disability. There's also a white supremacist who is fighting for his freedom, and various other prisoners we meet along the way. We also see a couple of fans, the commentator and inventor, the daughter of one of the prisoners, and all of these stories come together to create a really chilling picture of this world. And this is all a metaphor for the privatization of prisons for profit, and littered throughout this novel are facts and examples from the real world. For a book that is on the surface level so fantastical, so unrealistic, it really isn't a million miles from the real world. It's just a mashup of things that are currently happening with things that historically have happened. I feel really confident in saying that this is a special book that people will be reading for years and years to come. The hype is real. This book is fantastic. Blindness, Jose Saramago. Have you ever read a book that in so many ways was completely fantastic, but in other ways was just really terrible? This book. But I think the good things in this book well and truly overpower the bad. But at the same time, I could really understand any review of this novel. In this world, a man goes blind without a cause. Then the man who drove him home goes blind. Then the man's wife goes blind. Then the doctor who looked at him goes blind. And they all see nothing but white all of a sudden. The government acts quickly to isolate these people in a disused mental asylum. From there, you have this wonderful metaphor for an isolated or discriminated group. I suspect, given when it was written, the AIDS epidemic might have been on Saramago's mind. But like all good literature, it is relevant well after it was written. You can see COVID-style isolation being represented and parodied here, despite it being written in the early 1990s. Similarly, you could see historical things such as the way we have treated lepers in the past, the treatment of the Jews before World War II, racism in the USA, anywhere racist ghettos are encouraged, apartheid in South Africa. You can look at this as a metaphor for the divide between the poor and the rich, or for the mistreatment of the disabled. While the blind are left in this asylum, the military send in food so that they can eat. But the military are scared they're going to catch this violence, and they dehumanize the blind. When blind people struggle to follow basic instructions from the military because they're blind, the military, instead of explaining themselves, just threatens to shoot them. And they're constantly forgetting to feed the blind, or they're underfeeding them. And when the blind come and say, hey, there's actually 20 of us, they're like, go away or we'll shoot you. The blind form their own society and their own structure, which is a mirroring for the structures of society. What is power really built upon? It's almost Lord of the Flies-esque. I just think this is such a knockout, wonderful discussion that really captures how groups of people act together. On the other hand, the individual characters were poor. There was this one scene where a woman's food was being held hostage unless she agreed to be raped by a group of these men. And she says to herself, I just hope I don't feel anything. Not, I just hope they don't try and kill me because they clearly don't see me as a person, but I hope I don't feel anything. And I know after being raped, rape victims can feel incredibly guilty if they enjoyed any aspect of what happens. I know rape victims feel guilty if they orgasmed or if they got an erection during what was going on, and that requires therapy. And that is probably what Saramago was trying to show, but it was done really badly and back to front. That's something that people come to terms with after the abuse, not something they're scared of before the abuse. His characters just in general were ill-formed with really basic and simple emotions, and he struggled to show the conflict within characters, even when certain characters were contemplating acts they wouldn't do in a normal society. I don't want you to think that these quite big criticisms of the novel meant that I didn't enjoy it. Overall, this is a really spectacularly thought-provoking novel about society, about country, about power and violence, and the threat of violence, the systems of control, and what makes us human. It's such a worthwhile novel to read, so thought-provoking. Just a really, really good book, despite its flaws. Jude the Obscure, Thomas Hardy. I read this with a group on Voxer as part of Misery May, a readathon I was running myself with the wonderful Gemma from Gem of Books. And I really enjoyed the Voxer conversation because there were so many great people in the comments. You know who you all were. And there was such a range of opinions. Some people loved the book, some people didn't, some people landed somewhere in the middle. But that created this great conversation about a book. And sometimes the conversation about a book overshadows the book itself. I often enjoy talking about books that I don't really like, just because I enjoy talking about the book. This was my third time reading Jude, so I knew what I was getting myself in for, and I knew it's one of my favourite novels of all time. Jude is a young man who wants to study, to go to university, but he meets two women who really change the direction of his life, Arabella and Sue, who are about as opposite characters as you can get. Arabella is a really tough-spirited, fighting character. The kind of character who might do it tough but will always land on her feet. Morally grey and not opposed to having some fun. She doesn't fall in love so much as look for opportunities. Sue, on the other hand, is delicate, is virtuous and intelligent. She falls in love deeply, but not always with the right person, although she always tries to do the right thing. Through their relationships with each other, Hardy is exploring the ideas of marriage and ownership. And he's not saying the most complimentary things about those institutions. This is heartbreaking, it's tragic, it's melodramatic, and it's very depressing. One of my favourite novels ever, but very much a novel that is perfect for a certain kind of reader. And that reader is me, but I'm sure that others of you will really appreciate that sort of book. The Late Americans, Brandon Taylor. This was my first Brandon Taylor, and it was very, very good. I will be going back and reading his debut novel at some point. Although, I want to get the criticism of this book out of the way first. This is a book about a group of friends where our protagonist changes frequently, and it kind of felt like a collection of interconnected short stories with a common setting rather than a novel. Some of these characters I really wanted to explore more. It kind of felt like too many ideas for a novel, and that Taylor didn't quite know who the protagonist should have been. It should have been Noah, a young white male writer who seems to have sex with every man he meets. He doesn't seek it out, it just finds him. Noah is really opposed to traumatic fiction, to identity fiction, and so often criticizes his fellow authors in the class he is taking. They in turn criticize his fiction for not seeing the characters, for being very man versus world, very Hemingway, I guess. What is super interesting about this is that Noah is the victim of trauma himself. Noah could write the type of fiction he despises, but it feels to me he doesn't want to be judged on his trauma, but rather the quality of his writing. I love this observation of the literary world. I really feel like Taylor is taking both sides of the argument, and I don't think it matters what you think. You're going to have your ideas challenged by what he's written, and you're also going to have your ideas accepted. Isn't that wonderful? This is just such a great skill for an author to have, a wonderful conversation starter. It's not something that Taylor does for every issue he discusses. His view on abortion really comes through. By the way, he's not saying if it's right or wrong, but that men telling women what it is right or wrong to do and threatening them, that is wrong. And that's a really hard position to disagree with. We follow this diverse group of friends and lovers: the vegan who is dating the meat packer, the poor student who is dating the generationally rich man, the woman who has had an abortion, the only person with a job. And as they interact with the world, we really feel like Taylor is showing us real people and real aspects of society. This is just fantastic character work. This is what good literature looks like. In Memoriam, Alice Winn. Named after the Alfred Tennyson poem of the same name, this novel is going to be massive. Right now, I see this as the favourite for the Booker Prize. This is a novel about two men who fall in love in boarding school as World War I is breaking out. But neither of them realises that the other one has feelings for them. And I've called them men, they're boys. They're remarkably well off and privileged. When they join the armed forces, they're instantly given control over troops because that's their class. And what Winn is doing is she's showing us the structures of power within a boarding school, showing us children bullying young children, showing us the brutality and the mindlessness that is school, the tradition and the way things are done just because that's the way they're done. And then she's repeating this, she's showing this to us again, but in the guise of the army, in the guise of World War I. It's such a powerful metaphor. It speaks to the mindless brutality of war. Never has a book explained the just visceral discomfort and horrible brutality that the First World War was so well to me, and so simply and effectively. It was so easy to empathize with these poor soldiers. Throughout this novel, these characters grow from boys who idolize war to hardened soldiers who have seen their friends die. And the character development is grim and fantastic. The cruel wit and dark humor that develops in these boys is hauntingly sad and accurate and well done and a little bit funny. And then here's the thing that amazes me more than anything else. These men are part of the problem. They're not necessarily poor victims, but pretty terrible people themselves. And you see these massive holes in them, this giant sadness that is within them, and you understand where this anger is coming from, and you see this circle of abuse and confusion and mistreatment, and you feel for these characters through the horrible things they do as well as through the suffering they have. You really do end up empathizing with and understanding monsters and feeling sad for them and hoping that they will get better, hoping that they will learn to accept love. I have seen this book criticized for not being accurate to the gay experience during World War I, and this novel is generally pretty accepting of homosexuality, and I can't see that being an accurate representation of the times. But I don't feel like it trivialized the homophobia either. And for me, even if it's inaccurate, it doesn't take away from what this novel is doing. There's so much in this novel. One of the characters is half German. One of the characters is Jewish. There is an Indian character who discusses England in India while fighting for England in World War One. And this brings up English classism. And it's also very demonstrative of this divide between soldiers and people who didn't fight, and how these men would have just struggled to love people when they returned. And that made me like, what about when they took wives or husbands if they were gay? They wouldn't have been able to love them. Oh, it's miserable. Oh, I want to point out that this is a literary fiction novel that currently has a Goodreads average rating of 4.75, and that just does not happen. Literary fiction doesn't go that high on Goodreads. This book is remarkably intelligent. It's remarkably emotional, and it's remarkably readable. I think that it'll get a lot of comparison to Tom Cruise's fantastic novel, The New Life, and I think that's probably unfair on both books. This is a truly exceptional novel. That's all the books. Let me know any opinions you have, and please make sure you've subscribed to this channel and like this video. It really helps my channel grow. Let me know what you think of any of the books that I've mentioned here, and if you have a recommendation for me based on any of the books I've mentioned here, let me know in the comments. Bye bye.